All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. I'm joined by Dr. David S. Anderson, who is an associate professor and archaeologist at Radford University and a debunker of pseudoarchaeology. So, David, welcome back.
It's great to be back, Ben. I really appreciate being back on your show to talk about these issues.
Yeah, it seems like these issues are not going away anytime soon, unfortunately. I think within the last just year, you had another major quote unquote documentary come out, um, which I'm sure that you're happy to hear it being classified as a documentary, as well as other shows. So,
Yeah, there's a distinct problem with what the sort of public perception of archaeology is. And there's an immense level of popularity that these things that I would call pseudoarchaeology enjoy in the popular light. And so, I love doing what I do. I had a great summer doing a field season. We were excavating a Civil War fort. We were excavating a 19th century farmstead. We're doing some really neat stuff here in Virginia, but yeah, the headlines get to be like Atlantis found. It's like it's a little teeth grating at times.
yeah, it's found for the 10th time, apparently, or something. Yeah.
Oh, we're at least up to like the thousandth time.
Yeah. That's pretty ridiculous. Yeah, it's going to be refound, I guess, every year by someone new who's got some great story to tell. Yeah, so I mean, it seems like these TV shows are coming out nonstop. But do you remember the first TV show ever that you remember watching that was promoting pseudo archaeology?
The first big one, and I'm not quite old enough to remember seeing it when it came out, but I certainly saw some of the reruns. Was In Search of. It was oh no, I'm totally getting his name wrong. The guy who was pushing it in the first four episodes used to do the voice on Twilight Zone. And it was this big expose of being like, we're going to uncover these mysteries. And they did a 4-part miniseries, and they included ancient astronauts in that. And then when the show got picked up full time, Leonard Nimoy became the narrator of In Search of throughout the 1970s. And they repeatedly came back to ancient astronaut claims and other pseudoarchaeological claims and did a lot to popularize this notion that this stuff was out there. I certainly saw some of it when I was a kid, but it filtered out into comic books and pop culture and Time Life book series and everything else out there, and it has become sort of thoroughly prevalent throughout our culture now.
So that's interesting. I didn't realize that they had like celebrities helping promote that stuff that early. Because when did that show come out, like the 70s or something? Or
Yeah, so In Search of was gone in the air in the 70s.
and so they had Leonard Nimoy, and then of course they had I guess you said the host of the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, I feel ridiculous. I can't remember his name off the top of
Yeah,
my head.
I remember his name if I heard it, but yeah, I can't think of it either.
Because he had read, I can do the Google thing and fix my brain real quick. Because he had read some of Eric von Daniken, Rod Serling. There we go. Rod Serling
Yep.
had
Okay.
read some of Eric von Daniken's Ancient Astronaut Hypotheses books that came out in the late 60s, early 70s, and had become a fan of those, and was able to use his clout to get to the show on TV.
Wow. So even then, the celebrities promoting stuff was a big thing because obviously today we have, or at least within recent years, we've had Megan Fox had a show at one point, and William Shatner, I believe, had a show like Unexplained that talked about some pseudo archaeology.
Yeah, Unexplained is still on, and Shatner is still pushing some of those things. And there was a rather ridiculous Twitter blow up. Oh wait, excuse me, X blow up a
Yes,
couple of years
right.
ago with Shatner telling archaeologists that they didn't know what they were talking about. And it's like, you're a TV host. Like, I love Captain Kirk, but no, like a TV host does not know more about archaeology than actual archaeologists.
Yeah, this seems to be an ongoing trend, kind of the death of expertise, and in fact, experts are just hiding truth from everyone else. The whole conspiratorial mindset of the kind of 21st century we're living in that seems to be dominating everything. So
Yeah, and it's been a trend for a long, long time, and at least in part, I relate it when I work on this stuff more detail to the popularization of, or excuse me, the professionalization of science. This is certainly true in archaeology, and I've talked to people in other fields. As these disciplines grow and become more complex, and there becomes more data that you're expected to master, it becomes harder and harder for amateurs to get involved. There are great exceptions. There's really good examples of citizen science going on out there. But in general, it's, if you want to be an archaeologist nowadays, you kind of have to get a master's or a PhD
Yeah.
if you don't want to just dig the shovel tests, basically. And that's a lot of work and a lot of time. And it isolates the discipline in a very real way from the interested public. And so, and I've seen this in other fields, but it's as the field become more professionalized, as you need those higher education degrees, these kind of conspiracies start to come up because people still love these topics and still want to get involved with them. And so I love it when we see more citizen science. I love it when we see more public outreach among professionals.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a big part of it is like how to communicate stuff and make it relevant to everyone's everyday life, which is always a
Mhm.
challenging. At the same time, there's also, I guess, just the big factor of, the money's behind promoting these mysteries.
Yeah.
When you have, you're bankrolling these billion-dollar documentaries, as they call it, to promote some type of stuff. It seems like an industry that just is constantly cranking out stuff, and it's so easy to do because you just make up whatever you
Yeah.
want, and
Yeah.
just people will be like, "Oh wow."
And intrigue and mystery sell, and they're
Yeah,
interesting and they're fun. And I think that's something I talk to other archaeologists about. Like, you cannot just show people your pop shirts and expect them to be interested.
yeah,
There is a very real aspect of, it's actually one of the things I love about archaeology is I love some of the grunt level work. Like, put me on a screen and let me sift buckets of dirt. I will do that for days on end, joyful. I will scrub dirty artifacts and count them and weigh them and measure them. That kind of rudimentary work is fundamental to building up a larger understanding of what's going on. But it's understandable. This is, I tried for years to promote real archaeology on TV, and everyone tells me, like, well, real archaeology is boring. Like, yeah, we're not going to make you watch like 10 hours of someone sifting dirt. Like,
yeah.
no, I get it. That's not a story. That's not engaging, but it does build an engaging, good story that we want to tell. And so, it's a question of, we have to pitch our work to the public, because if the public doesn't care what we do, then we're out of business.
Yeah, I mean, there's a level of marketing that you wouldn't necessarily think you have to do getting into those fields, but I mean, I'm seeing this in history as well. The amount of stuff that people are talking about in history that is just not, there's no evidence for. And,
Yeah.
you have to, everyone basically has to start being able to sell their work in a way to the public and make it interesting, for better or worse, unfortunately.
Oh, and I think there's a way, especially when I was younger, I thought it was for worse. I thought it was cheapening or tawdry or something to pitch public discourse in that sort of sense. And it's like, I think I'm coming around. I mean, it can be done cheaply, it can be done tawdrily, it can go to the lowest common denominator. But if I love what I do, then I think I should be able to convey it in such a way that other people would at least find it interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, not everyone's going to want to do what I do. That's the classic as an archaeologist for decades now. If I'm getting in the bank and I have to tell people what I do, they're always like, "Oh, I've always wanted to do that." It's like, you don't want to do everything that I do, because
Yeah,
like
it's
I have to
true.
do a lot of like machete chopping and getting bit by ticks and whatnot too. But there's a fun, good, interesting side to what I do that I want to keep alive and convey to people.
Yeah, I mean, that's important, and it's good that people are like you were passionate about doing that, because I mean, it would be understandable for people to be like, I'm so busy just doing the archaeology in the first place. It's very hard to find the time to communicate it as well. Um, it's understandable from both those perspectives. And I agree, archaeology is super hard work. I remember doing it, and I've never been more tired in my life from getting up at like 4 a.m. to do excavations and then just working throughout the day and the heat and oh like my back soreness was, I've never been more sore my back from doing archaeology for just a month. It's like,
This was like, for me when I was younger, this is like speaks to my heart, because it's like I was really interested in history when I was younger, but I
Yeah.
also spent a lot of time hiking and backpacking. And I liked doing this like rugged outdoorsy sort of stuff. And I found a way to combine them. And we get the classics. It didn't happen, I had a great field season this summer with my students, but we didn't have any of the classics. But 2 years ago, we had a classic where we were trying to excavate around a 19th century cabin. And you know what happened? A vulture decided that was going to be her nest. And so we had to like negotiate around this very angry mother vulture for several weeks as we were trying to excavate and work around. And
My
it's
God,
just like, this is the nature of artwork, and I love it. And it's so much.
that's crazy. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. You never know what's going to happen in the field. All sorts of animals pop out. And I remember
Oh
I
yeah,
was stung by a bee a few times once when I was excavating. I was like, well, where did you come from? So
absolutely, absolutely. I think this last field season was surprisingly tame. We dug our holes, we got our stuff, and we came home.
that's good to hear. I'm glad you survived without too
Yes.
many crazy things popping up. So the shows that seem to be really popular right now when it comes to archaeology, there's Ancient Aliens, Ancient Apocalypse came out. Then, of course, as we mentioned before, there's Legends of the Lost and the Unexplained. What would you say are the major sort of theories being promoted in pseudoarchaeology that seem to be reoccurring?
The perpetual favorites, there are lots out there, but the perpetual favorites are Atlantis and Ancient Aliens. And the Graham Hancock's show Ancient Apocalypse, which came out back in November and was super popular on Netflix. What he rarely admits that he's been talking about Atlantis for decades, but in the show he's like, "Yep, we're looking for Atlantis." And his basic shtick, and it has been his shtick since the '90s, is that monumental architecture from ancient sites all around the world show evidence of some kind of lost civilization from 12,000 years ago. And he didn't always used to say that that lost civilization was Atlantis, but he's come around and said like, no, it's Atlantis, and he claims to show that like it's it's a lot of cherry picking.
Yeah,
And I should say, let me come back here too, because I actually fundamentally disagree with a lot of my colleagues. A lot of my fellow archaeologists have been very hard on Hancock, as that's true. We should be hard on Hancock,
right.
but they encourage the Society for American Archaeology to write a letter about his show and saying it should be reclassified as fiction and calling it dangerous. And these are, I have said this to my colleagues, these are bad ideas. Like, we turn ourselves into the boogeyman, we turn ourselves into the bully when we use our institutional authority to say, like, no, you must be wrong. I got into this. The reason I am here today is, as a graduating high school student, I bought one of Graham Hancock's books and I loved it. I thought it was amazing. It told a great story about this lost civilization, and I thought he was right. And then I went and took some archaeology classes and learned, like, oh, no, he doesn't have any evidence. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And he hasn't updated. He's been critiqued for 30 years, but he has refused to update his data. He has stuck more or less to his guns for the entire 30 years. That is, there's this ancient lost civilization, and it's mostly encoded in monumental architecture. And he's able to do this by ignoring chronology, ignoring cultural distance, ignoring that, just because there's 2,000 years between something, that kind of is a significant thing. I say there's 2,000 years between the different cultures. It doesn't matter that they both built pyramids. People built pyramids all around the world because that's the simplest and easiest way to build a large structure. Um, he doesn't have any of the potsherds. He doesn't have any of he doesn't know what they ate. Like, if you've got a gigantic global lost civilization, they need food. All of the major crops, wheat, barley, corn, rice, that we know today, we have archaeological and genetic evidence about when and where they were domesticated, and they all post-date his lost civilization. They all come after that. He can't tell us what food they ate, let alone where their houses were, let alone where they went to the bathroom. Like, he just looks at big giant pyramid monuments and says, like, oh, look, it's so cool. There's another one over here. Look, it's so cool. They must be related. Like, that's not evidence in any way, shape, or form. but it sells. It's fun. It's sexy. And like I said, when I was 18, I thought it was amazing too. I just read a few more books and realized, like, oh, wait, he doesn't have any data. So he's been going like gangbusters. Now, Ancient Aliens is a funny one because Ancient Aliens has been a perpetual fan favorite since the show debuted back in 2010, and it's been going strong more or less ever since. They've been dwindling in views and they've been running out of things to put on their show, but they've really moved over and picked up on the new UAP UFO sighting stuff,
Okay.
which, like I cannot pretend to be an expert on modern UFOs and UAP sightings, except to say that apparently they can still only be photographed in fuzzy form.
Shocking. Yes.
Like shocking the
For all
fact that
these years.
everyone or almost everyone's walking around with a high resolution camera
Yeah.
in on their phones now. We still don't have any decent photos of these things. And so but again, this is a topic that has become immensely popular. And so the show has kind of been able to piggyback off of that. I feel like I have to throw in a caveat too, because I know I get people upset. When I say I don't believe in ancient aliens, when I say that UFOs are problematic, people get really upset and say, like, how dare you say aliens aren't real? It's a big universe, it's a big galaxy. I am more than happy to think that there might be life out there. There might even be intelligent life out there. But the quality of evidence we have right now is abysmal to try and back any of that up.
Well, yeah, I mean, especially when you're talking about, stuff visiting us here. Yeah, I think, yeah, most astronomers and astrophysicists would say like, oh, surely there's something out there. But actually, if they're visiting here, that's a whole different story. We're talking about given the distances it takes to travel across the galaxy and the universe in general.
No. It was a couple of years ago. I don't remember the title of the book. It's in my office, not at home. But there was a book a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, that came out with like leading astrophysicists on the search for extraterrestrial life. And it was one of these books where I'm like, I ran out and bought it as soon as I could, and it was one
Yeah,
of the most boring books I'd ever read. Like
yeah,
we just don't have a lot of data. We're like a
yeah,
lot of interested people, but there just
yeah.
isn't a
A
lot of
book
data.
basically just saying we don't really know. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
like
Yeah,
there's all kinds of more exoplanets are being found all the time. That's
yeah,
really cool.
yeah.
Something's going to go on them, but we just don't know what.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I know. So I was like the Ancient Alien show, since it's trying to come, I guess, full circle here by talking about, recent UFO buzz. Are they trying to say like the ancient aliens are coming back, or what's the idea there?
I haven't, I don't know. I
Okay.
don't watch every single episode of them nowadays because, oh my gosh, some other brave people do that. So I'm not sure certainly back in the early days of the show, they didn't care about chronology. So it's like, I always do this every fall. In fact, I have my principles of archaeology class coming up this fall. And every fall semester, I make my intro to archaeology students watch episode 1, season 1 from Ancient Aliens. Because it we speak to the quality of data. I tell them all the time, like, you cannot critique things you have not consumed. Like, if you don't know what the basic fundamentals of what they're claiming are, then you shouldn't be critiquing them or attacking them. And so, like, we're going to watch it. We're going to watch what they actually said. And the great thing about season 1, episode 1, back from 2010, is that it was an homage to the work of Eric von Däniken. The ancient astronaut idea has been around actually for over 100 years in various forms. But it was popularized in 1968 by Eric von Däniken in his book Chariots of the Gods. The show that came out in 2010 was deliberately an homage to von Däniken, and he's been I don't think he's always an executive producer on the show, but he is occasionally an executive producer on the show to this day. And in other words, I tell the students, like, we're going to watch this. They had about 45 years to get this right, to get all of their ducks in a row and give us their best evidence whatsoever. And so we sit down and watch them, like, this is their opening homage to us. And what do they give us? And they give us all kinds of dribble. But what I love, because to your question about chronology, if you just watch episode 1 of the show, they cover about 10,000 years or so. Where they're like, here's all these different evidences, and they don't highlight the chronologies usually. They kind of like play them down or don't pay attention to them. But basically, they claim that aliens have been continuously visiting Earth for thousands upon thousands of years, and not like one spot on Earth, but all the way around the globe around Earth. like that, a global 10,000-year conspiracy. And what do they have? They have a wooden bird from Egypt that they think looks kind of like a plane instead of a bird. Like or what's one of the other, they got some other, they got some gold objects in that episode from Colombia that are insects or birds, but they're like, they couldn't be insects or birds, maybe they're fighter jets. Like
Wow.
it's like, this is their opening homage, and it's one of those things the students, I try to like be very clear in the episode, like, we're not trying to, like, I want you to honestly look, what is their data, how are they interpreting it. You know, already, they know already that I don't, subscribe to the theory, but I'm like, let's be as, as objective as we can be here. And the evidence is laughable from like right out of the gate, where they just have no context and no ability to like actually put it together.
So, are other professors doing this with their students these days in archaeology classrooms across the country, or do you think this is still relatively new for people to be doing this?
I've gotten, I think, tremendous feedback and response from my colleagues in the last like 5 years, where it has gone, a lot more professors are doing
Good.
this,
Okay.
or are engaging with these kind of issues. Absolutely. When I was in grad school and I was interested in these things still, because of my own personal background, absolutely, I had advisors telling me like, don't, that's just, no one cares. That's a lunatic fringe. Like, don't pay attention to them. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal. I think we've seen globally, conspiracy culture has been booming for the last 10 years in some very massive ways. But it's always been there. It's been a huge part of what everyone's dealing with in all disciplines. And, in the last several years, I've seen a lot more archaeologists step up and say, no, we have to talk about these things. We cannot simply ignore them. And that's really, really important. And we had a great productive session. I said, I don't always agree with my colleagues, but at the Society for American Archaeology, we had a session to talk about, how to react, how to engage some of these pop culture issues. And we had a great, interesting session. And it was we had about, there were 10 or so panelists, I believe. And then the room was full. There was 100 people in the room. The first time I tried to talk about this stuff at that same conference, back in 2012, we had a much smaller room. We absolutely are getting more engagement from our fellow professionals, but it's hard because, and this is, I talk about this a lot with some of my students because I teach a paranormal class. Like, there's no easy answer to getting out of these things, or to like, because, I was naive when I first started dealing with this stuff. I'm like, oh, you debunk it, you show where the logical fallacies are, and boom, done. You can go home and have a piece of cake. But it doesn't work that way. People can change their minds, but one shot and done is not in any way, shape, or form. A lot of archaeologists still do say to me, well, let's just put good information in front of people, and then we don't have to worry about the bad stuff. We still have to engage with the bad stuff because it
Right.
won't just go away. But there's no easy answer. There's no way to just, to demonstrate this stuff isn't true and move on with our lives. And so, I tell my students in my paranormal class, which everything you read, everything you consume, everything you watch, you have to know who wrote it, who produced it, who created it, why they created it, what their background is, what their audience is. Because if you don't know, it's so easy to be taken advantage of nowadays, to have someone tell you a convincing story, but not necessarily know what they're talking about behind all of that. And it's a tough world. We're going to have some AI sessions, and just, I don't even know where we're going with it this semester, but just with our students, we're going to talk about AI issues, and that is artificial intelligence, because it's already hitting my world. There's in February this year, some photographs started to circulate that allegedly showed British explorer, early 1900s, who went to Antarctica. I'm having a hard time with names these days. But these black and white early 1900 pictures alleging that he's found monuments and structures and buildings and pyramids in Antarctica.
Oh
And of course, they
gosh.
were all generated by artificial intelligence. But especially, in AI is only getting better, but especially with these, black and white, old, grainy photos, it's pretty easy to, or relatively speaking, easier to make convincing AI photos. And so we're getting into a place where like you don't know who wrote it, who produced it, why they did it. You don't know what you're looking at or reading or listening to at this point.
Yeah, sourcing is going to become more and more important with online, the internet. We already had plenty of issues with that, but yeah, with AI being able to produce essentially anything from scratch,
Yeah.
yeah, if you don't know where this stuff's coming from, then yeah, you could be believing all sorts of things. It seems like it's going to hit every single field of basically life in general. I mean, anything you're
Oh, it
doing.
really is. I'm a little bit terrified for the upcoming American election
Yeah,
next year
for
because
sure.
we're going to get all kinds of fake audio clips from the candidates. There's just no way we're not. We're already seeing them.
Yeah, yeah. It's crazy. It's yeah, happening really, really fast. Um, but yeah, back to what you were saying in terms of like communicating to people, I really think that yeah, people have to treat this like, a belief system because in many ways it is. I mean, whether it's like religion or political beliefs, the belief in the supernatural or pseudo archaeology, like that's something that is becomes very deeply ingrained into who a person identifies as. And
Yeah.
so it's you. I do find it funny because I've heard that too, where people just assume, oh, if you just write information as you were saying, if you just give them the right stuff, they'll make the right conclusions. That's like that has never happened ever when it comes
Yeah.
to communicating ideas to people. You have to be able to convince them um, in a very delicate way. That's very complicated, and that's only if they're actually open to being convinced in the first place. I think oftentimes, if someone who's like on social media posting about this stuff constantly, that's a person that's probably so deep into it, that probably shouldn't even be your target audience. The target audience should be people who are open to ideas, they're kind of interested in it, but don't know really what to make of it. The kind of just more open-minded people, because that's kind of the general public. I think overall is the average person watching like Ancient Aliens or something like that. I don't think is like a diehard Ancient Aliens person, but rather someone who's seen a few episodes, interested in the ideas behind it. And I feel like that's kind of like the majority that people should be targeting to try to like, hey, look, there's actual archaeology here we can discuss. And so
Yeah. And I've had over and over and over again people say that to me. Ancient Aliens is the classic show. But like, it's just fun to watch. We know it's ridiculous, or we know that it's not
yeah,
real, but it's ridiculous, and we like to watch ridiculous. And there was the whole. I never actually watched any of it. There was I think his name was Charles Bronson. There was some guy who was smoking pot and watching the show, and his show was like you watched him smoking pot while watching Ancient Aliens. And it had its own little fad moment there. And it's like, I absolutely get it that, sometimes it's fun to consume the ridiculous. I mean, I'm a huge sci-fi person, like, so it's a little bit different, but I mean, I love to read about alien life and time travel and all these sort of fun things. And it is fun. And there's a weird line in there somewhere. And I think most people are relatively comfortable in thinking that they know the difference between fact and fiction. That they know what's real and they know what's not real. And so it's okay and it's fun to consume some of that fiction while they keep in the back of their mind that it's not real. Unfortunately, I'm not, again, now I'm treading into territory that I'm problematic to speak about, but psychologists have done multiple studies showing that
yeah,
people do learn facts from fiction, and they learn incorrect facts. Like they'll do like controlled studies. I use an article in one of my classes about this. They'll deliberately introduce fake information into a fictional source, and then ask people, give people quizzes later on, and they will say like, oh no, this is real, I know this. People do learn facts from fiction, whether they want to, whether it's subconscious or whatnot. They do it all the time.
yeah,
And so we get this really weird sort of gray space where it's like, because I also don't want to be the guy who's just like, you can never make an Ancient Aliens like movie
right,
that has any kind of like Ancient Alien style theme, because it can be a fun theme. But if you're doing it, you have to know that you're treading into these territories where no matter how tongue-in-cheek or ridiculous you think you're being, some people will walk away thinking it's real. I might have said this last time I was on your show. The most recent survey data that we have, which is 2018, so it's getting old at this point, but in 2018, 42% of Americans thought that ancient alien contact was real. And so this is, it's like this is, if you think like, oh, we shouldn't get ancient aliens off the airways because I just watch it for fun, like, sure, maybe you just watch it for fun.
Right.
42% of people who are, also consumed it
Yep.
came away with a different answer. And, that's, especially when we go back to the politics and AI and everything else, like, when's the last time 42% of Americans agreed on something? Like, this is not a small number. It's not a fringe. It's a major reality problem.
Yeah. I mean, and yeah, I think that's kind of the thing I've been basically starting to understand more and more since high school, really, when like ancient aliens like first started to really pop up my radar because I saw the show, I saw it on TV, and I was like, okay, this is ridiculous. Um, and I didn't really realize how popular it was until I remember I was getting getting a ride with a friend for soccer practice, and they were talking about college, and I mentioned, oh, I'm interested in genetics and maybe doing that in college. And my friend's dad mentioned to me, he's like, have you ever heard of alien DNA? And I was just like, what? I'm like, huh? And I was like, not really. Just, oh, you should look into it. The show on TV, Ancient Aliens, we talk a lot about that. And I just like, wow, this is happening right now. This is a real thing,
Oh
and
yeah.
people are believing in it. And so, I think the majority of people are not like necessarily hardcore believers, but they believe, as you were saying, just enough that they're going to be in that 42% that think, yeah, oh yeah, ancient aliens probably are real or whatever. Um, it's scary. So
Yeah, and it's I think there's a general, like, I think it's understandable that, like, this stuff has been around for so long, you've consumed it and drips and drabs from different places, and it starts to it's like, well, it's easy to start thinking, well, there must be something there. And it's amazing how little there is when you start to lift the veil and start to look at what these alleged evidences are. Like I said, my students really lose it when I make them watch that first episode of the show. So I'm like, look, like, they're like, well, this is it? This is all they have? Like, yeah, this is all they have.
yeah,
It's like, I love it. There's a scene in that first episode too, where they talk about the boat pits at Giza in Egypt, where alongside the Great Pyramid, and I'm not sure if all three pyramids have it, but at least the Great Pyramid has it. There was a boat pit, and a boat was buried there to carry the pharaoh across. I don't know my Egyptian religion at all, so I'm not gonna. But it's a specific boat built there for the pharaoh in their afterlife, and there's a guy who comes on the show who says, like, no, they're not boat pits. They are giant circular saw pits where they would mount a circular saw, and they'd use those circular saws to cut the blocks for the pyramid. At which point I usually like can't help myself, and I look at the students. I'm like, you know why they call it a boat pit? Because they found a boat in it. Like, there was a boat in it. Like, did they find a saw in it? No, they found a boat in it. Like, if this guy finds the saw, great. And then maybe we can start talking about saw pits. But until you find the actual physical stuff, most of these ideas are pure fantasy. And, I try to walk, I don't, I feel like I have to walk back here too, because I get why people get dragged in by these ideas. They are sexy, they are fun, they're amazing. And so I don't want to ridicule the believers. I want to point out how thin these claims are.
yeah.
And it happens all the time. It's like I got an email. This is 7-8 years ago now, from my aunt who knew I was an archaeologist and knew I was into all this stuff, interest in all this stuff, who was like, I think they really have a lot of, good points on that show. And I was like, wait a second, we gotta
Uh-oh.
like pull this back. Like,
Yeah.
it is so easy. I love this woman. She's a wonderful woman. She's an incredibly smart woman. It's none of this is about being dumb. None of this is
No.
about
No.
not being interested. This is about that it is sexy, it is fun, it's alluring, it's mysterious. And what the problem is my fellow archaeologists who are in love with their potsherds. We've got to up our public game. We have got to be able to present what we're doing in more interesting ways. And again, that doesn't mean lowest common denominator. That does not mean selling ourselves out, but we have to think about the fact of we have to engage that public, because at 42% of Americans believing ancient alien contact is real, we're about to lose this game and lose it hard.
Yeah.
Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse was the most popular show on Netflix for at least a brief period of time. I don't know if that lasted for very long. His books regularly become New York Times bestsellers. We are losing this game. We're not like, oh, it's not like, oh, there's somebody coming up to threaten traditional archaeology. Like, no, we're actively already losing this game. And if we don't start pushing back and start talking about what's really going on, you don't want to see where we're going to be in 10, 20 years.
Yeah, it'll be yeah, all the funding is going to be going to searching for Atlantis or something. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy to think about. I think social media has done a very good job of exploding these trends from just being TV shows or books to being, global things that are getting popularity around the world and funding, major documentaries, as they say now. Also, I do think the podcasting space has definitely promoted a lot of this stuff. I think like the Joe
Oh,
Rogan
absolutely.
podcasts, Graham
Yeah.
Hancock's been on there several times.
Oh yeah,
Um,
Joe Rogan absolutely has a huge hand to play in sort of the undermining of archaeology.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's insane. I mean, that's like the most popular podcast I think in the world, and it's regularly hosting people promoting pseudoarchaeology. And you're seeing like even like small like YouTube channels popping up, like ones I never even heard about that are popping up promoting this type of stuff. So I think there's a guy named like Jimmy Corsetti or something like that. Bright Insight, I think is something.
And
And
Jimmy Corsetti has a very popular YouTube channel
yep,
called Bright Insight, where he's got himself onto the Joe Rogan podcast,
yep,
and his claim to fame was discovering Atlantis in the Sahara, where what he found was the Richat. I don't know how it's pronounced actually. I'm not even sure what language it is. The Richat structure, that is a eroded geological dome, and it's circular in nature because it's a dome. And Atlantis in Plato's description was built in concentric circles, and so since it looked like a circle and Plato described a circle, boom, he became famous and got international news coverage for claiming to
naturally.
find Atlantis. This is one where I like, this structure is so well known that it's got its own Wikipedia page, and there's actually been archaeology done in the region and in the dome area. It's so well known. There's literally a hotel built at the center of the Eye of the Sahara, as it's called.
Jeez.
Um, it's there again, like if you just watch his videos, you're like, oh wow, that's cool. And then you like, if you lift the veil, there's nothing there,
Yeah.
and it's pure conspiracy. But conspiracy sells like hotcakes right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's very much with like the this, like it kind of reminds me of the sphere that in terms of like pseudoscience that's been promoted a lot and like healthcare and stuff,
Yeah,
um like which has long been super popular, but it's interesting to see how the history space with archaeology and stuff has been taken over by it as well. um
yeah.
I
And I
mean,
think it's a good parallel to talk about because I think a lot of people understand the dangers of promoting pseudoscience in healthcare.
yeah,
People are going to die. And so I've met plenty of people who are like, well, who cares if someone believes in Atlantis? Like, that's not going to kill anyone. And the problem is that it's at a much subtler level, but
yeah,
at a massively institutional level.
yep,
I think one of the good ways to think about this is just look at, currency around the world. Governments put monuments from their nation's past on currency all around the world. If you governments and nations have repeatedly used their past, their history, their ancient past to promote themselves on the global stage, to craft national identities. We're talking about national level pride issues. There's constant back and forth between India and China about whether rice was domesticated in India or China first. This is in some ways, from my perspective as an American, this is like what? Like if it was domesticated here or there in 7,000 BC or 7,500 BC, it kind of all seems the same to me. And yet, at that level of national politics, going back and forth to India and China, this becomes a major
oh
issue.
yeah,
I was in a meeting once recently that it's a very short story, but basically I was in a meeting with somebody who we were talking about some stuff, and he's like, "Oh, but archaeology doesn't involve politics, so you don't have to worry about this." And it's like, Oh, yes, yeah. No, there's a lot of archaeology and politics intertwining, massively so.
Yeah,
It's just at those like conceptual national narrative levels. And so, it's which, not to undermine the importance of pseudoscience in healthcare, because there's a very real threat there,
sure.
obviously at an individual level. But these big, grandiose level, national narrative levels, it's how policy gets made.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the big concern, I think for me, what I've noticed is just that there's, you know, it's always, and I think the majority of people that believe, that get really interested in, pseudo archaeology stuff, don't really subscribe to it, but there are a lot of people that do use it this way to promote like ethnic centrism, some type of ethnic nationalism. Obviously, we've seen that historically, going back for years and years and years, of archaeologists wanting to promote their ethnicity as the main one in like the 1800s and stuff. And we even see with some of these documentaries. Um, I know there's a big flare up between the Egyptian government over that Netflix documentary by Jada Pickett Smith that came out,
Mhm.
about what was the ethnicity of Egyptians, and obviously there's lots of complexity there. Um, but I guess
Yeah.
because the documentary kind of depicted as all Egyptians being of like African ancestry, and all the pharaohs were, which obviously the Egyptian government was not happy about that. So,
Yeah, no, they got pretty upset, and it's a very interesting and complex problem,
yeah,
at that level of Hollywood. Because there was also a recent Cleopatra issue as well, where it's how should Cleopatra be depicted? And there's
yeah,
uh, from a standard Hollywood perspective, I think we should be in a place where like anyone can play any role.
sure.
And that's important and good, and valuable and necessary. Then you get to like, well, like what was Cleopatra's actual skin tone becomes a major debate, all of
Yeah,
this. And there's a very real historic discussion to be had there, which is different and separate from a Hollywood representation discussion.
yeah,
Uh, it's really complex and really problematic. This was actually my biggest problem with Marvel's Eternals movie, where like as you were saying, like you don't have to scratch very deep on most of these pseudo archaeological claims before you get to racism or ethnic bias going on.
yeah,
Most of these ancient alien claims, most of the Atlantis claims, even some of the stuff that showed up in Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse show, they're picking from old 19th century or older colonial narratives,
yeah,
where European colonizers around the world came across ancient ruins and said, well, couldn't have been the local people because we have disparaging views about the indigenous population. It must be some lost white race. And that lost white race gets used to explain monuments all around the world in the 19th century. And those claims are those examples are the same thing. Like Ancient Aliens has done this. They take the same examples that were used to support 19th century colonialism, but instead of calling it a lost white race, they are the aliens who are responsible in some way, shape, or form for doing all of this stuff. And the Eternals, if for the folks aren't familiar, this was one of the recent Marvel Comics movies a few years ago now. It's based off of a 1970s comic book by Jack Kirby. And the Jack Kirby comic book from back in the 70s is very explicit in a lot of different ways. He doesn't actually mention Eric von Daniken, but it's very obvious that there's some visual tie-ins, and that Kirby was inspired by Eric von Daniken to write an Ancient Alien comic book. I'm getting off the track here. I know this is weird, but this is Kirby was writing Ancient Alien comic books before von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods came out.
yeah,
Uh, and once Chariots of the Gods comes out, Kirby jumps back on the bandwagon. And so he doesn't repeat some of his older stuff. He actually adds von Daniken elements to his new stuff. And so Kirby picks up in this ancient alien narrative that some people needed help from aliens to build basic buildings and whatnot. And thus the Eternals were born. The new movie is a really interesting movie because from a modern Hollywood perspective, they went out of their way to have a diverse cast and have diverse actors and hire a Chinese American director. And it's a really important movie, but it's like the fundamental racial bias underlies the entire plot.
Yeah.
That some people, some certain people needed assistance from aliens in order to achieve or to get somewhere in life. And so you have this really weird mix of a great step forward against pushing back against structural racism, promoting a fundamentally racist story at the same time. And it's like, this is like, again, kind of one of those things where like, what do people take away from these shows? Maybe not what you wanted them to take away from them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's pretty hard, and I think it's one of those things where like the whole idea of ethnicity over time becomes murkier and murkier as populations mix, and so it's very hard to even know what people exactly precisely looked like at certain periods of time, and it's something that it would be good if we're in a place where people can just be comfortable, acting in a role and not worrying about matching necessarily the specific stereotype of what that role should be. While at the same time being able to tell people like, hey, the ethnicity, ethnically these people were Egyptian or ethnically they're this. You still want to make it historically accurate, but people shouldn't be working so much. I mean, we have to understand that most people playing parts in modern day films are not the ethnicity of Romans or something like that. Like it's
Well,
very complex. So
and I would add too that the past is far more ethnically diverse than we tend to think about it
oh,
as.
for sure, yeah,
The idea that there ever were pure populations or unmixed
yep,
populations is fundamentally not true. And one of the things that we know from the get-go, or the way that human evolution happened, is through interbreeding.
yep,
That have populations migrating out of Africa and interbreeding with other hominin populations around the globe. Like interbreeding between populations is entirely fundamental to what makes us human.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point because like the ethnicities that we may label in the ancient times were, quite diverse in the
Mhm.
first place, and so it's like, what does it mean to be, you know, Germanic at that point in time, thousands of years
Yeah,
ago? Like, well, it means a lot of things. It's just these groupings are very broad and just really
yeah,
grouping based on geographic, representation necessary, not even like the DNA from those people necessarily. I mean, you do the DNA test and you get all sorts of things popping up. I know National Geographic had a project called the Genographic Project years ago, and they would take your DNA and trace it back to Africa and see the migration patterns based on your genetic mutations. And just showed that, wow, you're really connected to everyone in so many different ways.
absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, ethnicity in general is pretty much a lot of just geographical trying to group people in some way to make sense of historical trends, I guess. But it doesn't really
Mhm.
mean a lot in terms of what it actually is
Well,
genetically.
our brains love to classify
Yeah.
things. Like it is all. I'm an academic. It's all about typology.
Yep.
The world is large and infinite and complex, and we need to break that complexity down for our brains to process it in some way, shape, or form, or for us to be able to communicate with one another in some way, shape, or form. And so this is part of, again, I'm pretending I'm not a psychologist, so I can't fundamentally to speak to psychology, but like I see all the trees outside my window, right? Like you don't want to have to just refer to each plant by its individual name. Like, no, we need categories of trees and bushes
Yeah.
and different types of trees and bushes for our brains to be able to break some of that down. It is fundamentally like I love it. As I teach our 100 level class where we cover human evolution too and whatnot. And I think it's one of the biggest things, one of the biggest misunderstandings that people have is that biological species are innate, that they are a thing. Biological species are classification systems in the same way that ethnic groups are classification systems, in the same way that trees versus bushes or red versus yellow is a classification system. Like we do light really quick. Like light is a spectrum. Like
Yep.
there's a rainbow, it's a continuous light spectrum from one end to the other of different wavelengths. We artificially draw lines in there to say how many colors there are. And we get this from Isaac Newton, one of the great, wonderful founding fathers of science. Isaac Newton used a prism to split a beam of light and say like, oh, look, there are 7 colors in the rainbow. Except the reason he picked 7 was because he was very into alchemy. And there was an alchemical text that argued there were seven resonant tones of sound. And so he figured if there were 7 resonant tones of sound, there should be 7 colors of light. Like the reason my daughter, my 5-year-old, says that there are 7 colors in a rainbow is because Isaac Newton was super into alchemy. The same thing's going on with species.
Yeah.
And we there's all kinds of great like interspecies hybrids that we can point to. Everybody knows the tigers and ligers that are
Yep.
out there, ligers and tigones that are out there. Like you can actually cross different species. And this is the thing, is that biology is infinite diversity, and our brains break them down into species so that we can more easily understand and classify that diversity.
Yeah.
Like there is no, this is how, you know, there is no like species X gave birth to species Y. It's thousands upon thousands of generations of small changes from one end to the other of infinite diversity that we eventually say like, okay, now they're too different from one another, so we're just going to call them different things. But it's all part of that same process.
Yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, I think the main idea here then is just that, like, hey, recognize that the civilization that encompassed like ancient Egypt, for example, was diverse, but also built the pyramids and should be recognized for doing that. But are also part of the human story in general. So, I mean, when you think about thousands of years ago, I mean, who knows, how many people have ancestors from ancient Egypt? If you're going back, so many generations, it could go. Lots of people could.
Absolutely.
Um,
They're
and
all
given how
human, and that's a good story.
yeah, and given how big the empire was, and geez, I mean, all the stuff that the ancient Egypt was doing. So yeah, it's interesting, and hopefully we can have more of a human understanding of how connected we are when it comes to these things, and not just try to make it like, oh, this ethnicity did this, no, this ethnicity did this, and it's like actually we're just kind of human beings. We're not really an ethnicity in general.
Mhm.
It's pretty much just, yeah, made up classifications to a certain extent. Yeah, there's DNA differences a little bit, but it's like, yeah, ethnically, I mean, we're all kind of diverse pretty much.
Yeah.
So
And yet those, I also want to make sure, like, hit back to the, I dislike, there's occasional anthropologists who have pulled this part of race being a myth in that sense, and it's not. From a biological
yeah,
perspective, like that, doesn't actually make any biological sense.
right,
But
yes,
it's a real social category that
yep,
therefore has real social
for
consequences.
sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would be great if we could just all, uh, you know, identify each other as other human beings, but we group each other by things historically and continue to do so today. It still dominates discourse socially nonstop, and societies in general just are very connected to these things. So it's something that hopefully science and archaeology and genetics and history can continue to reveal the complexities of these conversations, to the point where people start to realize, hey, let's actually try to create a more inclusive human story here together. Um,
That would be good.
ideally. So finishing up then, I just one kind of funny question. You know, do you think, is there at all some sort of rivalry between like the ancient aliens people and the lost civilization people? Just I just wonder, because these things are going on simultaneously. I'm like, at some point, it's either like, you guys are wrong, it's just ancient aliens, or no, it was lost civilization.
I have never seen it break out in public, but I
Okay.
love, because if you go back to the at least first couple of seasons, I believe, of Ancient Aliens,
Yeah.
Graham Hancock was regularly featured on the show being
Okay.
interviewed. And they edit him in such a way, like academics complain about this all the time, like the show edited me and made it sound like I said something different. Uh, they edited Ancient Aliens, edited Graham Hancock when he's talking about his lost civilization to make it sound like he's talking about ancient alien contact. And like he has to be at least a little bit annoyed by that, I would hope. But It's there. So there's at least that, but I have never seen them actually fight out or go after each other in public so far.
Because these groups, when they get popular enough, just like different religions, wherever, they start to break off into denominations. They start to
So,
splinter. At some point, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some kind of pushback between the two different camps, just because they're getting so popular that I feel like people can start to become territorial about their spheres of
oh yeah.
influence. So
Yeah, and there are some like little infighting, especially back in the '90s in the Lost Civilization crowd. But yeah, in terms of Ancient Aliens versus Lost Civilization, I have not seen too much.
might be a future episode to discuss the battles going on with that. Yeah. So what are
If
you
you put them
currently
into a
working on?
room together, like it can be like
Yeah,
two men enter, one man leaves, the Mad Max Battle Royale and Thunderdome. That's what I'm going for.
pretty
It could be
much.
Thunderdome, and maybe then we can just deal with one of them instead of both of
That's
them.
right. Maybe one of them will win, and then they'll make it less complicated for everyone else. Yeah. So what are you currently working on then these days?
Well, I've got some wrap up from the field season this summer, and so I've got a great little Civil War article that I need to pull together, talking about a fort here in Southwest Virginia, and then I've got an article that should be out. It's in press right now. It's been through all the peer review stages. That's going to be about Atlantis in particular, working with some folklorists.
Oh wow.
Where they are, Michael Dillon Foster is one of the lead editors, and Jeff Tolbert is the other editor. And Foster and Tolbert coined this term they called folklore-esque, which for them, in essence, is something that looks like folklore, but it's not actually traditional folklore. And they sent me an email one day out of the blue, and in essence, I've never had someone email me and like where it's like, wow, their work is so similar and overlapping with what I'm dealing with, and it was just a perfect fit. And so I have an Atlantis chapter for their new folklore-esque book coming out, where in essence, it's really what it is it's kind of like a history of the idea of Atlantis from about 1870 to 1911, wherein Atlantis is created as a modern concept, and it's done so in a very weird way, that outside of Plato, most people hadn't been talking about Atlantis before. But in that turn of the century time frame, Atlantis goes from being sort of this obscure Greek philosophy thing to being headline news. And so I try to follow that process and pull it apart and show how none of this was actually real. Even Plato, very, very obviously, if you read Plato's dialogues on Atlantis, it is extraordinarily clear that he's not talking about a real place.
Right. Yes. You're making my dog lift his ears because his name's Plato. So every time you're mentioning it, he's like, "Huh? What?"
It's your problem. You
That's
did
right.
it.
Your fault over there. Yeah. And you're still on all the main social media things. I think you're on Threads now as well.
Yeah. I've got DSA archaeology on Threads, and Blue Sky and Instagram, and I've got a Facebook page. I've more or less stopped using Twitter, because I don't even know what to do about this stuff nowadays, because I don't want to use Twitter because I don't want to support Elon Musk. I
Right.
don't really want to support Mark Zuckerberg either.
Yeah.
But
It's
I guess I'm going where the people are, so I'm
yeah.
trying to
It's
find my way forward. But I've got DSA archaeology on most platforms nowadays, everything but TikTok. I've never broken that
yeah.
window.
At TikTok, I think I draw the line there. It'd be too much effort to put into something like that.
Yeah.
So, so I guess you're
Digital
now.
editing, I have not learned.
Yeah, Twitter is now your X social media
Yeah.
platform, I guess.
Yeah.
Ironically, yeah.
I'm still there, so you can follow me there technically. I just haven't posted there for a while.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. Well, David, thanks again for coming on and sharing what seems to be something that's always relevant in this
Oh, yeah.
modern world we live in. So just we'll just keep chugging away and hoping things get better. So
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me. It's been great.